Hey there, game fans and Dubbie crew. Thanks for tuning in again. It's John here with another video about the Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast's OGL, or should I say, the end of the OGL. OGL 1.0, 1.1, 1.2 is dead. Long live the OGL. If that seems confusing for anyone who is following the OGL but somehow didn't see the news yesterday, well, I've got a great video for you. Let's go into the news that Wizards of the Coast, shockingly, there's nothing short of shocking, was released yesterday, which is essentially the OGL 1.0 will be staying in indefinitely, and that's the least exciting part of what they've released, because what they've also done is taken their entire body of work, the SRD 5.1, which essentially covers virtually everything at the moment for any D&D intellectual property, and have decided to make that all under Creative Commons. For those who know what that is, I'll pause here for you to say, wow. Because, wow, that's just huge. For those who don't know, I'll go into what that means, or what it looks like it means at this point here for a little bit. And what I'm going to update is, I didn't even have time to erase this from the board because this is coming completely out of left wing. From the last video where I've used my whiteboard here, I have left on Paizo's Persuasion because in my past video that I'd released only 2 days ago at this point, the news is changing so fast that it seems like it's much longer than 2 days, but essentially I'd gone over what WOTC's game is. Not the game Dungeons and Dragons, although that's obviously an important thing to discuss as well, but WOTC's game in terms of the persuasion play of how they've been handling their OGL debacle, and Paizo's game. And as I had given credit to several videos ago, Paizo's game is S tier. It is the best that you could have done, and WOTC's game is B tier. But before I jump into that, I'm going to give first a request to everyone. Thank you for those who are putting in comments. Thank you for those that are engaging and making this a community that is worthy of communicating with. That's all kudos to you guys. Especially, I want to give a shout out to Alan for his in-depth comments that he's had previously. There are lots of other people who have left lots of useful and good comments, but that particular one was what I was going to be talking about today in regards to the fan base. But I'm going to change the video a little bit here today because Wizards of the Coast has just done the thing that I've been saying on videos they're never going to do. And when I say never, I had hedged my bets on the videos to say the odds are 5%, maybe they went up to 10%, but at the end of the day, if it was 10% odds, it's now 100% success. It's looking like it's literally a situation where the fan base of Dungeons and Dragons has put enough pressure on Wizards of the Coast to have them not just listen to what you guys asked for, but exceed it. I haven't asked in advance, but I hope you won't mind, Alan. I'm just going to pop your comment that you've left on the last video that we had, checking to see if I'd seen the news, because I had seen the news. It's flabbergasting. But I think your comment sums it up best. In summary, without having it in front of me, you're essentially stating that the community has now been given everything they asked for and more. And I wholeheartedly agree. How can it be anything other than that? You now have not just the OGL 1.0, which at best would have been a gray area, because how would you trust that Wizards of the Coast could have possibly not entered into this situation again, even if they were convinced it was the wrong thing to do? You could never trust them from coming into it. Now that's out of their hands. For those who are not aware of the situation, maybe this is the first thing that you're tuning into, a very brief covering of what's happened, but first of all, I will point you to my past videos going over the different iterations of the OGL and what that has done to the market. I think I've covered the topic fairly well with a bit of a unique point of view. There are lots of other people covering this too, and this is breaking news, so as something changes with this, it could be more elaborated upon in the future as well, so I'll be happy to do that. As an aside, for those who have been leaving the comments, please continue doing so. I'm not going to stop talking about these types of topics just because this situation now has passed on to a next chapter at the very least, and that happens immediately. But in addition to that, for those who are liking the videos, engaging as a community, and for subscribing to my videos and giving us the views on it that makes us feel welcoming and respected for the opinions that we're putting forward, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Alan, for your last comments, because really what I wanted to get into with my video was how you had explained that Wizards of the Coast is not treating the fan community as really what it is closer to, which is almost like a fan fiction community, as opposed to a series of DMs that are working as a form of management. I'm not summarizing it super well because I'm still making sure I've got my head wrapped around what's actually changed yesterday, but in brief, the reason that Wizards of the Coast could have been at risk of losing tens of millions of dollars in what we called advertising revenue, in other words, by being good advocates for the game and being good ambassadors for the game and bringing their players along, in particular the DMs and the content creators who would be stating, this is the campaign that I'm running, and the players who are interested in playing a tabletop game are going to be playing the game that I'm running, and you would hope that's Dungeons and Dragons so that you'll be giving your money towards Wizards of the Coast. My argument in the past has been that is an important factor, but it's nowhere near important enough to have Wizards of the Coast change their opinion. The most likely answer at this point, to be clear, is that I'm wrong. That it is, in fact, enough money to change their course, because Wizards of the Coast has changed course. There is no other way around it. This is a complete 180 degrees from the OGL 1.1 or the OGL 1.2. And again, to cover that with the depth that it requires, I would recommend that you watch some of the past videos so that this one doesn't turn into an hour-long video, because it would. There's been a lot of discussion happening over the last couple of weeks. In short, the most likely scenario today is that Wizards of the Coast has not just reversed the decision, but now enshrined in law under Creative Commons that you have access to virtually the entire body of Dungeons and Dragons that would fit under the SRD 5.1. What that means, for those who aren't familiar, is there is a system reference guide, I believe it stands for, a system reference document, which covers all of the intellectual property that Dungeons and Dragons would have that could be licensed. In other words, for those who aren't familiar, a game mechanic, such as taking a d20 and rolling it to determine an outcome, is not something that can be copywritten. That's why other competitors to Dungeons & Dragons have access to that too. I believe Dungeons & Dragons would have been the first game that actually did that when it was created close to 50 years ago now. But other games are able to use that and are able to use the same types of mechanics that you find across video games and other types of board games, because none of those mechanics are copyrightable. What would have been copyrightable, and until yesterday was copywritten, was to have, for example, the different races and abilities that different races would have within Dungeons & Dragons. That's intellectual property. And in the past, they gave access to that under the OGL. OGL 1.0A is what's been in effect for 22 years. Wizards of the Coast had attempted to change that to be able to shut some of that information out or prevent people from using that in the future. Because of pushback on the community, or at least what appears at this time to be pushback from the community stating, we don't want anything like this, what we want is open access to this, Wizards of the Coast has now said through Ryan, and again, we'll put these links up here on the screen as well so that you can see the post that was put on D&D 1 yesterday. I'll also have a link for it so that you can read it in all of its glory directly from there, should that be of use to you. In short, they're saying the community response has been overwhelming. We do, in fact, hear you, that we understand that you guys do not want OGL 1.0 touched, so they brought it back. It was never really removed, but the discussion was clearly showing that it was going to be reformatted to something else in the future, and now it's not. But that wasn't good enough, because, of course, if they had talked about changing it in the past, they could talk about changing it in the future. And so what they said in addition to that is, we're also taking everything that's covered under OGL 1.0 and everything else in this massive 400-page document that covers, as near as I can tell, every single piece of intellectual property that Dungeons & Dragons would have, and that is now put into Creative Commons. I'll go a little bit more in depth about Creative Commons, but in short, what you need to know right now is Creative Commons addresses a lot of the potential loopholes that were causing this murky water and a lot of these issues under OGL 1.0. The biggest of them is OGL 1.0 never said it was irrevocable, meaning that the company that was issuing it, Wizards of the Coast, could have said, even though it's a perpetual license that you all have access to, we've decided to stop the perpetual license. And if you imagine the license as a string, they just go snip. Everything created before this point, you still get it, but everything created now no longer has access to that license. Figure it out on your own. Instead, they've brought it under Creative Commons. Under Creative Commons, it is very clear, ironclad as any law can be, that it is irrevocable. It is perpetual. It is irrevocable. It is not reversible. Ryan, I believe it's Kyle actually, I don't know why I'm saying Ryan, but the main director of Dungeons and Dragons, who's actually been updating the community and had released the survey that people had been filling out over the last 2 weeks, which it looks like 15,000 people approximately answered the survey with enough of a robust answer to effectuate this change, as near as we can tell, had been putting in that the way he phrased it was actually very good. When you go through Creative Commons, it's a one-way door. You do not get to reverse that decision. And he didn't say the decision is coming. In releasing the SRD 5.1 in PDF, which they did, with the new header, which gives the CC-NA explanation, and that NA explanation is even more generous than I'm going into just yet. Essentially, in doing that, the Wizards of the Coast has now said, this is now public domain. Use it as you want, it's now in the public domain. The second they did that, it's irreversible. This is irreversible. This is irrevocable. That's it. Everything in the SRD 5.1 is open for you guys to use. And not just to use, you get to profit from it. You can monetize it as you see fit. The reason you can do all of that is because of that special -NA designation. It would have been possible for Wizards of the Coast to say, for example, we are putting this all under Creative Commons. However, if you use it, you're also going to agree to put your property under Creative Commons as well. That's a designation that you can do. Another designation they could have done is it's under Creative Commons, but it is only under Creative Commons as long as you don't monetize it. You cannot use it for corporate use. You can only use it for your own personal use. The community might have been fine with even that, but Wizards of the Coast didn't pull any punches this time. They said, no, you can use it however you see fit. It is yours for all intents and purposes. There is one thing you have to do to be able to use it, and at this point I will pause in the video just to say, please actually go read the license as well. I'm not a lawyer. I am not telling you that that is legally clear for you to use at this point. Although in layman's terms it is, you should make sure if you're actually planning on monetizing something that you read the full letter of the law that's in the license. Not even just their brief description, but the entire body of the license. But in short, for us lay people, what it means is as long as you give Wizards of the Coast credit and you confirm that this is their material, you can use it however you see fit for as long as you see fit. And no matter who takes over Wizards of the Coast in the future, no matter what happens to Dungeons and Dragons, this decision's done. It's now in the legal body. Someone would have to open an entire court case against Creative Commons. That part's not going to happen. I'm aware I had said previously this whole step wouldn't happen. This one I was wrong about. No lawyer is ever going to tell you that you could fight Creative Commons the way that it exists today. It's done. Basically, all Wizards of the Coast said is, as long as you do my following step that I include, you're good. All you need to do is...
say my name.
Dungeons and Dragons.
You're goddamn right.
That's kind of it. That's all that you need to do to make sure that you're covered. So, we don't know what that means yet. I want to be clear, the most likely answer as to how this could have possibly happened is that I, and people that were predicting that Wizards of the Coast could afford these kinds of losses, that we were wrong. Wizards of the Coast either got cold feet and decided, no, the losses that they're experiencing are too much, which is possible. From what I can see from news reports, Paizo has had 8 months of sales in the last 2 weeks. They're a much smaller company than Wizards of the Coast, but that's shaping up to be a phenomenal year for them. Other competitors are reporting similar things as well. They're basically at a backlog to be able to fulfill these orders. What that's all saying together is the community was able to say, no, don't take away our stuff, or we're leaving. And Wizards of the Coast said, oh, okay, here's that and more. I don't know if that'll entice a lot of people to come back, but I imagine it will. The community right now, from what I can see, is mostly surprised. You guys seem cautiously optimistic, and I think you should be at this point. But mostly it's kind of a, does this mean you stay with Dungeons and Dragons? If you said you were leaving, and they've now not just reversed their decision, but given you even more for free, and perpetually and irrevocably, does that satisfy it? I don't know. It might. If your claim all along, though, has been the community has more power than you think, at the moment, I'm going to say that's the most likely answer. It's not the only possibility, and I'll touch on that a little bit here as well, but if your answer is, John, it's pretty clear, the community has a lot more clout than you thought we did, I will say, yep, if I had a hat, I would tip it off to you now. You're right, that is the easiest explanation for what's happening here. Because of that, because of what I'm going to state, it's pretty clear Paizo and WOTC have to have their rankings changed here. WOTC isn't B tier. I mean, they lost, so they must be something completely different for that. And I'm just going to get this erased here because I have to readjust this already. It's that quick. WOTC, we can't call them as good as B tier. We can't say that they're anything close to that. If they were caving at this point, or if they made this big of a mistake, what's their persuasion like at this point in time with what we know? They're S tier, guys. This is one of the single best moves that I've ever seen someone make. They're so S tier that we're changing the entire scale here. Paizo, overnight, went down to B tier. They switched places. Here's how. How's the ORC looking now? Just overall, all the companies that were signing up under the Open RPG license, under the ORC, how's that looking? I can tell you what Paizo's immediate response to this was. Pretty lackluster. Surprised, like everyone else, and I think that's genuine. They were essentially stating they're glad to see that the OGL 1.0 isn't deauthorized, and that it won't be deauthorized, and they're marching on ahead with the ORC, with the ORC, which is, for those who aren't familiar, essentially a consortium of every single competitor except for Wizards of the Coast. So every single person who makes a tabletop RPG game or something similar is going to come together to decide which parts of their licenses they're going to have as an open license and which parts aren't, so they don't have to rely on the OGL anymore. Good move. And before yesterday, that was such a good move, and such a good move for Paizo in particular, because they were orchestrating this on their own dime, that I'm calling that some of the best persuasion I've seen from a small company. And Wizards of the Coast, the big evil corporation run by Hasbro, either because they got scared, or because they're this good at things that we underestimated them this much. And to give some credence to that, a few days ago in my video, I had also said when I was doing this persuasion that there was one thing that Wizards of the Coast could have done to up their persuasion from B tier. I didn't think it would be this big, but what my answer would have been, as I would have been talking in some future videos, was to say Wizards of the Coast could completely backpedal and say the OGL 1.0 stays in place and we're going to add the word irrevocable to it, and that would change the argument so much that it would set their competition off from the losses they'd already had. It would have been a better thing had they not had the 1.1 released or leaked in advance, things like that. They could have done a better job for their persuasion, but I didn't see them being this good at their persuasion. At this point, as near as I can tell, the ORC, they're going to go ahead with that, but at this point, it just looks like they're being the stingy, greedy companies. Immediately, we went from Wizards of the Coast is too greedy to realize what they're doing to the community, to they are not just the biggest company, but they are the ones with the most open, most generous contract that you could possibly have. You do not get more open than, here's all of our intellectual property, use it for whatever you want. That is as open as you can get. All of the people talking about Paizo's ability to design the OGL and the work that they were doing towards that, now with the ORC, my main question for them would be, you're only giving some access to your stuff? Why? What about the rest? What about the rest of Paizo's intellectual property? How come you can't match what Wizards of the Coast is doing? Immediately, that whole paradigm has shifted. It's that staggering. Here's what I'd be concerned about for the future as well. in the coming weeks and in the coming months, as I'm exploring deeper into this myself, and as hopefully you guys as a community are helping me explore here too, we're going to learn one of two things. One would be, if Wizards of the Coast experienced this kind of loss, can we monetize that? Or can we at least measure that? If, and again, I know I'm calling on you a lot here, Alan, but in your past comment where you'd said this is worth tens of millions of dollars, let's now say you're correct. Can we try to figure out how much that actually is? Can we figure out what Wizards of the Coast actually lost? Can we monetize it? Can we say, not just the money in the community, not just the boost that Paizo's getting, but what's the bottom line impact to Wizards of the Coast? The reason that would be really valuable down the road is this might be the only example that I've ever seen, and I have looked into some of the other examples that you'd mentioned through fan fiction with Anne Rice's work, with J.K. Rowling's work, for example, Alan. I didn't see anything in those that would have been a financial impact to those authors. So I agree, I think the analogy works that this community is a lot like a fan fiction community, in that a lot of the works that you're creating are fan fiction based, as it were. You're essentially taking a different intellectual property, using that scaffolding or using that rigid framework of a world that's built or the characters that are built to then have your own stories placed within that world. So I think the analogy is fascinating and a good one to look at. What we can see is it doesn't look like fan fiction anger or the fan community anger made a dent in Anne Rice's sales while she was alive. And certainly this was an event that happened back in around the year 2000. Over the last 2 decades, it seems like her books have sold perfectly fine. J.K. Rowling isn't releasing the same number of books and things that she used to, but what I will point out is her licensed properties video game that's coming out is, I believe, in 3rd for the best-selling video game as a pre-release right now. That could change, but at the moment it's looking like anger from the community isn't impacting the sales of either of those products. This might be one of the only examples in history of a group of fans who have had a measurable impact on a company to reduce their sales. This just doesn't happen. Like, I know that many people like an underdog story. The reality is underdogs don't win. This might be a case where you won. It also might be one of the most masterful plays from Wizards of the Coast in the long term. And in touching from that, it's why the orc now suddenly doesn't seem very good. Dungeons and Dragons is a household name, and anyone who sees anyone playing a tabletop game understands that it's the only tabletop game. Those of us in the community who know, and even I'm a sort of outsider sort of breaking into the community, those of you who have been in this for a long time, you know about things like Pathfinder, you know about games like Fate, you know about the other options that are available, but your everyday person knows nothing about that. Essentially, Dungeons and Dragons just said, our intellectual property, it's worth $0. Here it is for free. Go use it. Why would they do that? Just honestly, why would a company say one of our intellectual properties is worth nothing? Is it possible it's worth nothing? And here's what I mean by that. Their calculation could be, we are always going to sell to new customers, to new players who are going to be coming into the market. We have a movie coming out relatively soon. We're going to sell every toy that we could possibly have. The tabletop RPG version of our game, of our property, is worth nothing. What is valuable is our ability to distribute toys around the world. What is valuable is the fact that when you see someone rolling a die on a table, the only thing you'll ever think is Dungeons and Dragons. That's why I picked the video clip that I did.
Say my name.
Dungeons and Dragons.
You're goddamn right.
Say their name. It's the only one you know. If you're an outsider, say their name. If you're going to go play Pathfinder, the argument that I've seen in the community for the most part is Pathfinder or Fate or any of the other alternatives. The way you describe it is it's like Dungeons and Dragons with these parts fixed. It's a fixed version of that game. Dungeons and Dragons, and Wizards of the Coast, because they're the owners of Dungeons and Dragons, might have said, if every one of our competitors is already copying our game, if their main selling points are our game with certain things fixed, and it's a matter of opinion about whether it's better or worse, if the only comparison point in the world is you have Dungeons and Dragons and then everything else attempting to copy Dungeons and Dragons, and they are able to copy all of those things, then the intellectual property itself is worthless. We don't need the intellectual property. All we need is the fact that every other company is going to be releasing stories that drive players to Dungeons and Dragons. In other words, it could be a case where Wizards of the Coast is saying, you guys as a community want this so bad? Here you go. Go ahead, make money from it. Can you? As content creators, can you take the new information that's now granted to you and profit from it? Or can you only help Wizards of the Coast profit by using it? I don't know. At this point, I don't know the answer to that. In the coming months, as we figure out more, if it looks like Dungeons and Dragons continues an upward trajectory, because tabletop RPGs are continuing an upward trajectory, if Paizo continues growing, if Green Ronin continues growing, if all of the other competitors also continue growing, but if Dungeons and Dragons continues growing, especially as these other companies have certain things that are proprietary, and now Wizards of the Coast has nothing with D&D that's proprietary at the moment, I don't know that that means they lost. That might mean they won. And I don't even know how I feel about that. I'm neutral about business. I want to see businesses succeed, except when they don't deserve to succeed. If that works, I don't know, there's a whole business course there in some way to figure that out. That would be very interesting. That's how I'll phrase that for now. That'd be very, very interesting. Again, I want to emphasize, I think the most likely answer here is I, and Wizards of the Coast, completely underestimated the strength of the D&D community. And if that's the case, congratulations, first of all, because you have something that's not imitable throughout the rest of the world. I'd like to figure out how you got to that position and help educate me on that if you don't mind. That would be really helpful to figure out how you can be that invested in something without directly profiting from it, because I don't see how DMs are paid, for example. In fact, I think that's part of the big issue in the community. If you're providing all of this free labor to Wizards of the Coast, my question would be why? If it's so much free labor that Wizards of the Coast can say, we need that free labor far more than we need our entire body of intellectual property, why would you guys do that for them? Just realistically, why would you give them that much? Where does that leave us today? Well, if Wizards of the Coast did this on purpose, not the entire journey from start to finish, but if Wizards of the Coast did this on purpose and have now handicapped their opponents, made the orc obsolete, and did it all to continue getting the free labor that the community might be providing them, that would be one of the most masterful things that I've ever seen. But I think the most likely answer for the moment is that you guys as a community have a lot more power than you thought you did, or than I thought you did. It sounds like many of you in the community believed you had this power, and despite all odds, appear to have had it. What does that mean for Wizards of the Coast's future with this? I don't know. If they are taking that big of a financial hit, this could be a really bad year for them. It could be a really bad year for D&D overall. It could be a really bad year for the competitors as they try to figure out, can they go with common usage here as well? Do they have to continue with their orc? Or is it better for them to continue with their orc? There's a lot up in the air now, and I'm interested and excited to continue figuring out how that journey is going to fit together. In the meantime, as a community, you guys should take some time to celebrate. If you were hoping to continue operating D&D under the OGL 1.0, you have that option, and you have a much better option. Honestly, the OGL 1.0 is now defunct because the alternative is just better. The common licensing is significantly better. It's just exactly what you should have. This is just really interesting. Overall, I'll continue exploring into this for you guys, for those who enjoy my perspective towards it, and please help me share this perspective out there as well. And just another tip of my hat to you guys. If this is a case where you guys as a community have won, celebrate, party hard. You guys have earned it. And if I'm just starting to get into this community, that's an exciting one to be joining into. One that has, as near as I can tell, actually been a Goliath that's taken down by a community of Davids. That's a weird analogy. I'll end with a weird analogy. Have a great day, everyone.